Your grocery bill has doubled in the past 4 years. Your rent is up 40%. Gas prices swing wildly, but never seem to return to what you remember paying a decade ago. Politicians blame corporate greed. Economists mumble about supply chains. But the real answer, the structural reason your money buys less every single year, was decided 80 years ago in a hotel in New Hampshire, by men you have never heard of. July 1944. World War II is still raging. American soldiers are dying on beaches in France. Soviet tanks are grinding toward Berlin. Japanese kamikazes are crashing into American carriers in the Pacific. But in the quiet mountain resort town of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, representatives from 44 nations are gathering for a conference that will matter more than any battle being fought that summer. They are not discussing military strategy. They are designing the architecture of the post-war financial system. And the decisions made in that hotel over 3 weeks in July 1944 created the inflation you are experiencing right now in 2025. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented economic history. The Bretton Woods Conference established a system where the United States dollar would become the world's reserve currency, where gold would back the dollar at a fixed price and where all other currencies would be pegged to the dollar. It gave the United States the ability to print the global money supply. It was the greatest economic privilege ever granted to a single nation. And it was built with a fatal flaw that guaranteed it would eventually collapse, taking your purchasing power with it. The story of Bretton Woods is the story of how empire is maintained, not with armies, but with central banks. It is the story of how inflation is not a natural phenomenon, but a policy choice. And it is the story of why the system created in 1944 is now, 80 years later, collapsing in real time, with consequences that will reshape the global economy in ways most people cannot yet comprehend. To understand why 44 nations gathered in New Hampshire in 1944, you need to understand the economic chaos they were trying to prevent. The period between World War I and World War II, roughly 1919 to 1939, was one of the most economically unstable in human history. It was defined by competitive currency devaluations, trade wars, hyperinflation in some countries and deflation in others, and ultimately a global depression that helped bring Adolf Hitler to power. The delegates at Bretton Woods had lived through this chaos. They were determined not to repeat it. But the solution they designed created problems far worse than the ones they were trying to solve. After World War I, the international gold standard, which had governed global finance for decades, broke down. During the war, countries had suspended gold convertibility to print money to finance the fighting. After the war, they tried to return to the gold standard, but at the old exchange rates, which no longer reflected economic reality. Britain, for example, returned the pound to its pre-war parity with gold in 1925, even though the British economy had been severely weakened. The result was deflation, unemployment, and economic stagnation. Other countries, facing similar problems, began devaluing their currencies to gain export advantages. This triggered a race to the bottom. In 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard entirely. Other nations followed. Without a common monetary anchor, exchange rates fluctuated wildly. International trade, which depends on stable currency values, collapsed. The Great Depression deepened. Unemployment in the United States reached 25%. In Germany, economic desperation fueled the rise of the Nazi Party. The lesson seemed clear. The international financial system needed rules, stability, and a mechanism to prevent competitive devaluations. That is what the delegates at Bretton Woods believed they were creating. But there was a second agenda, one that was less about preventing chaos and more about establishing dominance. By 1944, it was clear that the United States would emerge from World War II as the dominant economic and military power. Britain was exhausted, financially dependent on American loans. France had been occupied. Germany and Japan were being destroyed. The Soviet Union, while militarily powerful, had suffered catastrophic losses. Only the United States had an economy that was growing, not shrinking, during the war. American industrial production had doubled between 1940 and 1944. The United States held 2/3 of the world's monetary gold reserves. This gave the United States enormous leverage at Bretton Woods. The American delegation, led by Harry Dexter White, understood that whoever controlled the post-war monetary system would control the post-war world. The British delegation, led by John Maynard Keynes, understood this too and fought to prevent it. But Britain was a debtor nation negotiating with its creditor. The outcome was never in doubt. The Bretton Woods Conference opened on July 1, 1944, at the Mount Washington Hotel. Officially, it was called the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. The term United Nations at that point referred to the Allied powers fighting the Axis, not the international organization that would be created after the war. The conference lasted 3 weeks. Over 700 delegates attended, representing 44 nations. But the real decisions were made by two men in private meetings: Harry Dexter White for the United States and John Maynard Keynes for Britain. Keynes arrived at Bretton Woods with a proposal called the International Clearing Union. It was an elegant system designed to prevent any single nation from dominating global finance. Keynes proposed creating a new international currency called the Bancor. It would be used only for settling accounts between nations, not for domestic transactions. Each country would hold reserves of Bancor, and trade imbalances would be settled in Bancor rather than gold or national currencies. The system would penalize countries that ran large surpluses or large deficits, forcing adjustments that would maintain balance. The beauty of Keynes's proposal was that it prevented any nation from accumulating permanent advantages. It would have created a truly multilateral system. But it had one fatal flaw from the American perspective. It would have stripped the United States of the ability to control the global money supply. The Bancor would be managed by an international institution where the United States would have influence, but not dominance. Harry Dexter White rejected the Bancor immediately. The American proposal was simpler and far more advantageous to the United States. The dollar would become the global reserve currency. All other currencies would be pegged to the dollar at fixed exchange rates. And the dollar would be convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. This meant several things. First, it made the dollar as good as gold. Any country holding dollars could exchange them for gold at a fixed rate. This gave the dollar credibility and ensured global demand. Second, it meant that every nation needed dollars to engage in international trade. If Japan wanted to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, the transaction would be denominated in dollars. Third, and most importantly, it gave the United States the ability to print dollars and export them to the rest of the world, knowing that those dollars would be held as reserves rather than immediately converted back to gold. Keynes understood the implications. He fought against the American plan, arguing that it would give the United States too much power, that it would allow America to run permanent trade deficits without consequence, and that it would eventually lead to inflation, as the United States printed more dollars than it had gold to back. But Britain had no leverage. The British economy was sustained by American loans. Keynes could protest, but he could not prevent the outcome. On July 22, 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement was signed. The dollar became the world's reserve currency. The system Harry Dexter White designed was now the law of international finance. But the agreement contained a promise, a constraint that was supposed to prevent abuse. The United States pledged to maintain the convertibility of dollars into gold at $35 per ounce. This meant the United States could not print unlimited dollars. Every dollar in circulation had to be backed by a corresponding amount of gold in Fort Knox and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. As long as this promise was kept, the system would remain stable. But the promise was a lie. Not an intentional lie at the time it was made, perhaps, but a lie nonetheless. Because the temptation to print more dollars than you have gold to back is overwhelming, especially when you have an empire to maintain and wars to fight. And 27 years later, the lie would be exposed. For the first 2 decades after Bretton Woods, the system worked relatively well. The United States ran modest trade deficits, exporting dollars to rebuild Europe and Japan. The Marshall Plan, which transferred $13 billion to Europe between 1948 and 1952, was effectively an export of dollars that returned to the United States as European nations used them to buy American goods. The Korean War, fought from 1950 to 1953, required military spending, but the United States maintained fiscal discipline. The amount of dollars in circulation remained roughly in line with gold reserves, but in the 1960s the equation changed. President Lyndon Johnson launched the Great Society, a massive expansion of domestic social programs including Medicare, Medicaid, and the war on poverty. Simultaneously, the United States was escalating involvement in Vietnam, a war that would eventually cost over $800 billion in today's dollars. The government was spending far more than it collected in taxes. The deficit exploded. And to finance the deficit, the Federal Reserve printed money. Lots of money. Between 1965 and 1970, the money supply increased by over 40%. But the gold reserves did not increase. The United States had the same amount of gold in 1970 as it had in 1950, but far more dollars in circulation. Other countries noticed. French President Charles de Gaulle was particularly suspicious. De Gaulle did not trust the United States. He believed America was exploiting its privileged position at the center of the financial system, printing paper dollars and exchanging them for real goods from other nations, while the gold reserves that supposedly backed those dollars quietly disappeared. In 1965, de Gaulle publicly questioned the Bretton Woods system. He argued that the United States was abusing its reserve currency status, and he demanded proof that America still had the gold to back the dollars in circulation. Then de Gaulle did something that sent shockwaves through the international financial system. He began converting France's dollar reserves into gold. Under the Bretton Woods rules, France had the legal right to do this. Any nation could present dollars to the U.S. Treasury and demand gold at $35 per ounce. France sent ships to New York to collect the gold and transport it to Paris. Other nations watched closely. If France could successfully demand gold, maybe they could too. Germany began converting some of its dollar holdings. Switzerland followed. By 1968, gold was flowing out of the United States at an alarming rate. The mathematics were becoming impossible to hide. In 1950, the United States held approximately 20,000 tons of gold, roughly 60% of all the monetary gold in the world. By 1970, that had fallen to about 8,000 tons. Meanwhile, foreign-held dollars had increased from 10 billion in 1950 to over 80 billion by 1970. If every country simultaneously demanded gold for their dollars, the United States would default. There was not enough gold in Fort Knox to honor the promise. The Bretton Woods system was built on a guarantee that had become mathematically impossible to fulfill. President Richard Nixon faced an impossible situation. Foreign governments held more dollars than the United States had gold to redeem. If the run on gold continued, America would be forced to declare bankruptcy, admit it could not honor its obligations, and watch the entire international monetary system collapse. But there was another option. The United States could simply break the promise. On the evening of August 15, 1971, Nixon appeared on national television to address the nation. He announced a series of economic measures to combat inflation and unemployment. Buried in the middle of the speech was a single sentence that changed the world. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily. That was the word Nixon used. It has now been 54 years. The suspension is permanent. Overnight, the dollar became a fiat currency, backed by nothing except the promise and power of the United States government. Gold, which had been fixed at $35 per ounce, began to float. By 1974, it had reached $180 per ounce. By 1980, it hit $850. The market was pricing in the devaluation that had occurred. The Bretton Woods system was dead. But the dollar's role as the global reserve currency did not end. That was the remarkable part. Despite breaking the central promise of the system, despite demonstrating that the dollar was not as good as gold, the world continued using dollars for international trade. Why? Because there was no alternative. The other major currencies, the Deutschmark, the yen, the pound, were tied to economies smaller than America's. They could not provide the liquidity the global economy needed. And the United States still had the largest economy, the strongest military, and the deepest financial markets. The world was locked into the dollar system, even though the original justification for that system, gold backing, was gone. But without the gold constraint, a new problem emerged. If dollars were no longer backed by gold, what prevented the United States from printing unlimited amounts? The answer, as it turned out, was nothing. Nothing except political will and fear of inflation. And over the next 50 years, that proved insufficient. The United States needed a new mechanism to ensure global demand for dollars. Without gold backing, dollars were just paper. Why would Saudi Arabia accept paper dollars for oil? Why would China accept paper dollars for manufactured goods? The answer came in 1974 with a secret agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia. In exchange for American military protection, Saudi Arabia agreed to price all of its oil exports exclusively in dollars and to invest surplus oil revenues in U.S. Treasury securities. This created the petrodollar system. Every nation that needed oil, which was every nation on Earth, was forced to acquire and hold dollars. This replaced the gold backing with oil backing. It was a brilliant solution to the problem Nixon's decision had created. But it also meant that American monetary policy was now permanently tied to maintaining relationships with oil-producing states and preventing any alternative reserve currency from emerging. The consequences of the post-Bretton Woods system have been profound and largely invisible to most people. Without the constraint of gold convertibility, the United States has been able to run permanent budget deficits and permanent trade deficits without facing the currency collapse that would destroy any other nation. When Argentina or Turkey or Venezuela prints too much money, their currencies collapse. Inflation spirals out of control. But when the United States prints trillions of dollars, as it did during the 2008 financial crisis and again during the COVID-19 pandemic, the inflation is exported globally. Every country holding dollar reserves sees the value of those reserves slowly erode. This is the hidden mechanism of how Bretton Woods, even in its broken form, has transferred wealth from the rest of the world to the United States for 80 years. Here is how it works. The United States runs a trade deficit, importing more than it exports. To pay for those imports, it sends dollars abroad. Those dollars accumulate in foreign central banks as reserves. Foreign central banks then lend those dollars back to the United States by purchasing treasury bonds. This allows the United States to finance its deficit spending without raising taxes or cutting spending. It is a circular flow that only works because the dollar is the reserve currency. The scale is staggering. As of 2024, foreign governments and entities hold approximately $8 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities. They also hold trillions more in dollar-denominated assets, bank deposits, corporate bonds, real estate. That is real wealth, real goods and services that other nations produced, that they exchanged for paper dollars, and that they continue to hold because the dollar is the reserve currency. If the dollar loses that status, those trillions of dollars would flood back to the United States as foreign holders try to exchange them for other currencies or real assets. The resulting inflation would be catastrophic. This is why the United States has defended dollar dominance so aggressively. Every war in the Middle East over the past 50 years can be understood, at least in part, as a defense of the petrodollar. When Saddam Hussein announced in 2000 that Iraq would begin selling oil in euros instead of dollars, the United States invaded 3 years later. When Libya's Muammar Gaddafi proposed creating a gold-backed African currency to bypass the dollar, NATO intervened in 2011 and Gaddafi was killed. The pattern is consistent. Threaten the dollar's reserve status and American power responds. This is not about democracy or human rights. This is about maintaining the financial architecture that allows the United States to print the world's money. But every system built on unsustainable advantages eventually faces a reckoning. The Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1971 because the mathematics became impossible. The post-Bretton Woods petrodollar system is now facing its own mathematical impossibility. The United States has accumulated over $36 trillion in national debt. Annual interest payments on that debt now exceed $1.1 trillion, more than the defense budget. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2034, debt will reach $54 trillion with annual interest payments exceeding $1.7 trillion. These projections assume interest rates will average 3.6%. If rates remain at current levels, near 4.5%, the interest burden will be even higher. At some point, the mathematics break. Either the United States defaults on its obligations, which would destroy the dollar's credibility and end its reserve currency status immediately, or the Federal Reserve monetizes the debt by printing money to buy treasury bonds, which creates inflation that erodes the dollar's value more slowly but just as surely. Both paths lead to the same destination. The dollar loses its role as the global reserve currency. The only question is timing and mechanism. And there are signs that the transition is already beginning. China and Russia have systematically reduced their holdings of U.S. Treasury securities over the past decade. China's holdings peaked at $1.3 trillion in 2013. By 2024, that had fallen to $775 billion, a reduction of over $500 billion. Russia liquidated nearly all of its treasury holdings between 2018 and 2020, dropping from 96 billion to less than 2 billion. Where did that money go? Into gold. Russia added over 1,500 tons of gold to its reserves between 2014 and 2024. China, while officially reporting modest gold increases, is estimated to hold far more through state-owned entities and unreported purchases. This is not portfolio diversification. This is preparation for a monetary system where the dollar is no longer dominant, and they are not alone. According to the World Gold Council, central banks globally purchased over 2,000 tons of gold in 2023 and 2024 combined, the highest two-year total since the 1960s when the Bretton Woods system was collapsing. The infrastructure for a post-dollar system is also being built. China launched the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System (CIPS) in 2015 as an alternative to SWIFT, the dollar-based international payment network. CIPS now connects over 1,400 financial institutions in more than 100 countries. Russia developed its own alternative, SPFS. These systems allow international transactions without dollars. In 2022, Saudi Arabia began accepting Chinese yuan for oil payments, breaking the petrodollar's 50-year monopoly. As of 2024, approximately 20% of China's oil imports are settled in yuan. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, expanded in 2024 to include Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Iran. This bloc now represents 42% of global oil production and over 40% of the world's population. At their 2024 summit, BRICS nations signed a declaration supporting settlements in local currencies rather than dollars. This is not theoretical planning for a distant future. This is operational infrastructure processing real transactions right now. The parallel system runs alongside the dollar system, and every month, more volume shifts from one to the other. The transition is gradual, but the direction is unmistakable. History provides a clear precedent for what happens when a reserve currency loses its status. The British pound was the world's dominant reserve currency for over a century, from the mid-1800s through the end of World War II. At its peak in 1900, the pound represented over 60% of global central bank reserves. Britain controlled the largest empire in history, dominated global trade routes, and London was the undisputed financial capital of the world. But World War I shattered Britain's finances. The cost of fighting from 1914 to 1918 exhausted the treasury. Britain emerged from the war as a debtor nation, owing enormous sums to the United States. Britain tried to maintain the pound's reserve status through the 1920s and 1930s, but the economic foundation had eroded. In 1931, Britain was forced to abandon the gold standard. The pound's value fluctuated, confidence declined. Other currencies, particularly US dollar and German mark, became more attractive for international reserves. After World War II, Britain was financially dependent on American loans. The empire was being dismantled. Economic growth was anemic. By 1956, the Suez Crisis exposed Britain's weakness definitively. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France invaded to retake it. The United States, opposed to the invasion, threatened to dump British bonds and force a devaluation of the pound unless Britain withdrew. Britain capitulated within days. The lesson was clear. Financial power trumped military power. By 1976, just 30 years after being the world's reserve currency, Britain was forced to request a bailout from the International Monetary Fund because it could no longer defend the value of the pound. The IMF imposed strict conditions, austerity measures, spending cuts, effectively treating Britain like a developing nation. The pound's share of global reserves fell from 65% in 1950 to under 20% by 1980. The transition from reserve currency to secondary currency took approximately 30 years. But the acute crisis, the moment when everyone realized the pound was finished as a reserve currency, happened in less than 2 years between 1974 and 1976. That is the pattern. Gradual decline punctuated by sudden crisis. Now look at where the dollar stands. According to IMF data, the dollar represented 72% of global central bank reserves in 2002. As of 2024, that figure is 58%, a 14 percentage point decline in 22 years. But the rate of decline is accelerating. Between 2002 and 2020, the dollar lost 10 percentage points over 18 years. Between 2020 and 2024, it lost 4 percentage points in just 4 years. If this acceleration continues, the dollar will fall below 50% of global reserves sometime between 2028 and 2032. Economic research suggests that reserve currency status operates on network effects. As long as everyone believes the dominant currency will remain dominant, it does because everyone continues using it. But there is a tipping point, generally estimated around 50%, where the network effect reverses. Once the dollar falls below half of global reserves, holding dollars shifts from being an asset to being a liability. At that point, the decline accelerates into a stampede. The British pound's decline from dominant reserve currency to IMF bailout took 30 years. China began significant reductions of treasury holdings in 2013. That puts the danger zone for the dollar directly ahead. Somewhere between 2025 and 2035, we are, right now, in the window where the acute crisis could occur. The trigger could be a debt ceiling crisis that causes a U.S. credit downgrade. It could be a confrontation over Taiwan that leads to sanctions and counter-sanctions. It could be a sudden spike in inflation that forces the Federal Reserve to choose between crushing the economy with high interest rates or letting inflation run and destroying the dollar's credibility. The specific trigger is unpredictable, but the structural vulnerability is undeniable. What does this mean for ordinary people? When a reserve currency loses its status, the consequences are severe and long-lasting for the citizens of that country. Britain's experience after 1945 provides the template. The standard of living declined. Imports became more expensive. The government lost the ability to borrow cheaply. Infrastructure decayed because there was no money to maintain it. Brain drain accelerated as talented individuals left for countries with better opportunities. The UK went from being the world's dominant power to being, by the 1970s, a declining industrial nation plagued by strikes, inflation, and economic stagnation. It took 30 years and profound economic reforms under Margaret Thatcher to stabilize, but Britain never regained its former position. The United States will face a similar adjustment, but on a larger and more disruptive scale. For 80 years, Americans have enjoyed a standard of living subsidized by the dollar's reserve status. The ability to print dollars that the rest of the world holds as reserves has allowed the United States to consume far more than it produces, to run perpetual trade deficits, and to finance government spending through debt rather than taxation. When that advantage disappears, the adjustment will be painful. Imports will become significantly more expensive as the dollar weakens. Consumer goods, energy, food, everything the United States imports will cost more. This will feel like inflation, but it will not be temporary. It will be a permanent repricing of the dollar's value. The federal government will face a fiscal crisis. The ability to borrow trillions at low interest rates depends on global demand for treasury securities. If foreign central banks are no longer buying, or worse, if they are selling, interest rates will spike. The government will face a choice. Cut spending dramatically, which means ending or reducing programs that voters depend on. Raise taxes substantially, which will be politically toxic and economically damaging. Or print money to finance the deficit, which will accelerate inflation and further undermine the dollar. None of these options are palatable, but one will be chosen. And the choice will determine the shape of the American economy for the next generation. The decisions made at Bretton Woods in July 1944 gave the United States 80 years of economic privilege unmatched in human history. The ability to print the world's reserve currency, to export inflation to other nations, to borrow without limit and consume without producing, created wealth and power that transformed America into the dominant force of the 20th century. But that privilege was always borrowed. It depended on the rest of the world accepting dollars as a store of value. And that acceptance depended on trust. Trust that the United States would maintain fiscal discipline. Trust that the dollar would hold its value. Trust that America would use its power responsibly. That trust is breaking. Not all at once, but steadily, measurably, inevitably. The mathematics of $36 trillion in debt and $1.1 trillion in annual interest payments are incompatible with maintaining a stable reserve currency. The weaponization of the dollar through sanctions and asset freezes has taught other nations that dollar reserves are not safe reserves, but hostages that can be seized. The construction of alternative payment systems, the accumulation of gold, the decline of the dollar's share of global reserves, all of these are not theoretical risks. They are observable processes happening now. The system created at Bretton Woods in 1944 collapsed in 1971 when the mathematics became impossible. The system that replaced it, the petrodollar system, is collapsing now for the same reason. The mathematics no longer work. The debt is too large. The deficits are too persistent. The inflation is too visible. And the rest of the world is no longer willing to accept paper dollars in exchange for real goods indefinitely. When the British pound lost its reserve currency status, it did not happen overnight. It took 3 decades of gradual decline followed by an acute crisis that lasted about 2 years. The dollar is following the same trajectory. The gradual decline has been underway for 2 decades. The acute crisis phase is likely ahead of us, possibly within the next 5 to 10 years. For individuals, this means that the assumptions that governed financial planning for the past 80 years no longer apply. Holding cash and bonds, the traditional safe assets, may not be safe if the currency itself is devaluing. Diversification into assets that hold value across currency regimes, real estate, commodities, foreign assets, equities in productive companies, becomes more important. For nations, it means the architecture of global power is shifting. The post-World War II order, built on American economic and military dominance, is ending. Not because of military defeat, but because of financial exhaustion. The debt accumulated to maintain that dominance has become unsustainable. And when the debt can no longer be serviced without destroying the currency, the dominance ends. The inflation you are experiencing now, the doubling of grocery bills, the explosion in housing costs, the sense that your paycheck buys less every year, is not a temporary phenomenon caused by supply chains or corporate greed. It is the inevitable consequence of a monetary system designed in 1944 to give one nation the ability to print the world's money. For 80 years, that system transferred wealth from the rest of the world to the United States. Now, as the system unravels, the inflation that was exported for decades is coming home. The promises made at Bretton Woods are being broken, just as the promise made in 1944 that dollars would be convertible to gold was broken in 1971, and the result will be the same. A repricing of the dollar, a loss of purchasing power, and a transfer of wealth from those who hold paper to those who hold real assets. The Bretton Woods Conference in July 1944 was sold to the world as a plan to prevent economic chaos. In reality, it was a plan to concentrate economic power in the hands of the United States. That plan worked spectacularly for 80 years. But every empire built on unsustainable privilege eventually faces the moment when the mathematics catch up. For the dollar, that moment is not in the distant future. It is now. The system is unraveling in real time. And the inflation you see in your grocery bill is the leading edge of a far larger transformation that will redefine what money means and who controls it. The answer, as always, will be written not in policy papers or conference halls, but in the simple, brutal language of mathematics. And mathematics, unlike politicians, never lies.